Greetings, Fright fans, and welcome to Horror Beneath the Surface, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the inner workings and mechanics of the horror genre at large, including but not limited to books, film, and television. I am your host, Professor Terror, otherwise known as Mark. Stick around. Today's episode, The Night Santa Went Crazy, Yuletide Horror, Act 1, The Morgue. We dissect a deceptive Santa slasher that offers much more than meets the eye, that film being Silent Night, Deadly Night. Act 2, The Crypt. Here we discuss Christmas slasher classic Black Christmas and delve into one of the first and best rendered final girls of the genre. Act 3, The Obituary. Silent Night, Deadly Night was not the first Killer Santa movie, so why all the controversy? We take a deep dive into the trivia and events surrounding the release of that film. Today's episode of Horror Beneath the Surface is brought to you by Pine Tree Audio. The holidays are hard enough. Your audio equipment needs should not be. Pine Tree Audio designs and handcrafts audio solutions at the highest level of quality, providing customers with passive preamps, speaker selectors, power supplies and filters, speaker power cables, auxiliary cables, and more. Visit Pine Tree Audio on the web today. In 1984, Silent Night, Deadly Night debuted in theaters November 9th. Our film begins with a family taking a car trip. Our main character is Billy Chapman. At this point in the film, he's around 6 to probably 8 years old, if that. The family arrives at a nursing home facility on Christmas Eve. They are there to visit Grandpa, who appears to be catatonic. They talk to him a little bit, but he gives no indication that he even knows that they are there. A doctor takes the family aside to discuss some medical information, and little Billy is left with Grandpa. It is at this point that Grandpa comes to life, so to speak. He asks Billy if he knows what Christmas is really about and who Santa really is. He tells him that Santa is not as nice as he's made out to be and that Billy should be afraid. Santa comes around to punish naughty children. Billy is understandably freaked out. Hell, I was watching this film as an adult and I was freaked out by the actor's performance. When the parents come back, Grandpa has resumed his catatonic act. I've always wondered what the deal is with the grandfather character. Does he do that on purpose for some reason? Does he come in and out randomly that he can't control? Who knows? It's never really addressed, and Grandpa is not mentioned again. The family begins the car ride home. I get that it's Christmas, but I've always wondered why they drove several hours to visit a catatonic grandpa for like 5 minutes only to drive back for another, who knows how many hours. On the trip back, it's getting dark. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, a man dressed in a Santa suit robs and murders a convenience store clerk. As Billy, his parents, and his infant brother are in the car driving, they see a Santa in the middle of the road near a broken-down car. He waves at them, and the parents, thinking that A, this is a good idea, and B, that he must have been on his way to some Christmas party and had automotive trouble, decide to stop and help him out. The Santa shoots the father. As the mother tries to flee, Santa tackles and murders her. During this point, Billy has run from the car and hidden in a ditch. Santa looks around for him shortly, then gets in the car and takes off. We resume a few years later with a slightly older Billy, now living in an orphanage run by nuns. His brother is there too, just in case you were wondering. In class, when asked to color holiday-themed pictures, Billy colored a picture of Santa stabbed to death and a decapitated reindeer. Kinda sounds like something I would have drawn at that time as a kid, and I didn't at all have the same kind of holiday experience that Billy had. I just like drawing weird shit. Young boys, kids, comic books, violent movies, all that fun American stuff. Billy gets sent to the principal nun's office. She is holly and jolly and understanding about Billy and his circumstances. I'm kidding, of course. She has the standard Catholic, let's beat love and acceptance into him approach that unfortunately was not uncommon well across history. I'm hoping the Catholic Church has evolved somewhat in the last 20 years. I hope. Billy apologizes, but Principal Nun does not believe him and sends him to his room. The younger nun says something intelligent and progressive in terms of psychology. She says that the picture is proof that Billy remembers all the violence he witnessed as a younger child, and the violence is trapped within him. Principal Nun is understanding, and they devise a method of dealing with his behavior. I'm kidding. She says she doesn't give a flying saint about what the younger nun thinks. For some reason, Principal Nun thinks that he has no memory of what happened to him or is unaware, and she needs to punish some sense into Billy. She wants to force him into coping with the death of his parents. Young Nun says he gets worse every Christmas and fears that he may be irreparably damaged if he goes on like this much longer. Younger Nun seems to indicate maybe he should get help from an actual mental health professional. Principal Nun is unimpressed, and she says she'll take care of it personally. Always a good sign. After some time in his room, Young Nun comes to him with compassion and asks if he wants to come outside with the other children and build snowmen. He says he can't, and Younger Nun tries to tell him that Principal Nun only wants what's best for him, yada yada yada. If you believe that the egotistical, emotionally abusive nun wants what's best for Billy, I have an island off of Florida to sell you. At a great price. While heading outside to play, he is distracted by a sound coming from down the hall. He finds a door and looks through the keyhole to see some older kids from the orphanage, or perhaps staff. It's never really explained who they are. I think they're older kids, but who knows. Having sex. He watches for a short time, rather perplexed by what he sees. He is caught by Principal Nun because Billy, if you haven't guessed it by now, is an extremely unlucky character in film history. The sex triggers a flashback to his parents' murder, and he is tossed aside by Principal Nun, who starts whacking the horny kids with a good old-fashioned belt. A few minutes later, Principal Nun finds Billy outside and tells him that sex is evil and naughty. She goes on a tirade about punishment, and I kinda just want her to find some BDSM club and alleviate her sexual frustrations as opposed to taking it out on orphans, but hey, what do I know? Despite the fact that Younger Nun told Principal Nun that she convinced Billy to come out of his room, Billy gets in trouble for leaving his room. She takes him back to his room and beats him with the very same belt she beat the horny teens with. I'd really like to point out that so far into this movie, Billy is very respectful and not at all out of control or wild. And frankly, he has every right to be that way if he was, considering what he's gone through. She tells him to go back to bed and stay there. That night, he has nightmares of his parents' death and the trauma that he witnessed. His nightmares wake the others, and Principal Nun is pissed as she needs her beauty sleep. She told him to stay in bed, and of course the worst mortal sin is seemingly disobeying or slighting a nun in any way, shape, or form. She does the only sensible thing she can think of and ties his arms and legs to his bed. You don't have to have a degree in psychology to realize that someone suffering from PTSD and flashbacks, that tying them to a bed mid-flashback is a bad idea and far from helpful. Younger Nun is sympathetic, but crotchety old Principal Nun tells her to stay out of it. A short time later, it is Christmas Day. The kids of the orphanage are opening presents and all is good. Principal Nun remarks that she sees nothing but greed and materialism. There should be thankfulness and such. Yes, of course, these orphans who have nothing, and one of which his parents were murdered by Santa, have so much to be thankful for. So much. Younger Nun is bringing Billy down for Christmas. Principal Nun talks to Billy, and he responds to her in the same way he always does, respectful, but for some reason Principal Nun accepts it this time. She tells Younger Nun that her methods have worked, and that there will be no more trouble with Billy. Isn't she forgetting what Proverbs says about pride? Younger Nun says that he's always better after Christmas is over. Most of the rest of the time of year, he's fine, or at least considering the trauma he has suffered. I highly reject this notion, but I kind of get what they're saying. I'm sure the Christmas season is always worse on Billy. Anyway, Billy grabs his present from under the Christmas tree and unwraps it with the rest of the kids. It's then that Principal Nun tells Younger Nun that it's almost time for their annual visit from Santa Claus, and Principal Nun says that Billy will sit on his lap and behave. From what I've already told you, you didn't actually think this was going to get better, did you? At the very least, honestly, the beginning section of this film should always be shown in psychology classes, and as assigned as like an essay on everything not to do with child psychology, or life. Santa comes in and sits near the tree and the kids line up. Billy, understandably, doesn't react well. Big surprise! Principal Nun drags him kicking and screaming to Santa. She's pissed that he's not 100% submitting to her will. Like I said, biggest mortal sin, not respecting a nun's authority. Billy jumps off Santa's lap and gives him a left hook. Santa flies off the chair and hits the floor. Santa has a glass jaw, apparently. The punching sequence should come off as funny or wacky, but somehow it plays pretty good and doesn't pull me out of the film. I'm sure there are other people who disagree, but I don't know. It's just matter of fact. Billy runs up the stairs and curls into a ball in the corner. Understandably so. 10 years later, Billy is now an adult and working in a toy store. The Younger Nun has got him a job doing the stockroom work. The owner is skeptical at first, but Billy is big and strong and can do the work easily. At first, he seems to be thriving and does a good job, despite the fact that the other guy that works back there doesn't do anything but watch Billy work and act like a dick. So yeah, it's a normal job. Side note, you can see in the background, in a lot of the shots, a lot of name brand toys and characters, including Star Wars, Matchbox, Batman, Spider-Man, G.I. Joe, and Little Tyke, to name a few. While none of these are overt, they are definitely visible, and I'm surprised that nobody kicked up a fuss. Especially considering the way that people go after copyright, especially these days. At the store, there's a girl about Billy's age that flirts with him, and he, for the most part, flirts back and acts normal. But of course, all good things must come to an end. The Christmas season is upon our characters again. Also, the other backroom storage guy likes Billy's stock girl crush, and when he talks about her like a piece of meat, Billy is less than pleased. Stockroom douche guy says that lately Billy's been a dick. This is Principal Nunn all over again. As an audience member watching this movie, Billy seems the same, but to the other characters, he's got a quote-unquote attitude. Stockroom douche guy says that he has to do Billy's work. I highly doubt this, but normal job stuff. In my experience, the more coworkers complain about how much work they have to do or how busy they are, the less they actually do, and they're not busy at all. Every damn time. Billy walks out and sees the store Santa Claus, which triggers a flashback, because of course it would. Flirty Stock Girl is concerned and helps him in a rare instance of someone in this movie actually being nice to Billy. Billy goes back into the stockroom and has a sexual fantasy about Flirty Stock Girl. It's weird, but seemingly innocent-ish, until Santa comes out of nowhere and stabs them. Billy wakes up from a dream. I guess it was a dream and not a fantasy, but the way it's cut is a little bit ambiguous. He is freaked, understandably so. Christmas Eve rolls around and the store Santa is sick. The manager needs to put someone in the costume. Guess who gets roped into it? Yeah, Billy. The worst person to put in the costume in the history of cinema. You could have put anybody in there. Hannibal Lecter. It would have been better than this. It warps him, further than he was already warped, which is saying something. The day's over, and the store closes. The supervisor is thrilled to have hauled in such a bunch of Christmas Eve money. They start the store party and begin drinking. Stockroom douche guy and Flirty Stock Girl end up in the back and begin to make out. Flirty Stock Girl begs him to stop. Billy walks in, sees them being quote-unquote naughty. It doesn't go over well. Billy and Stockroom douche guy start to fight, and Billy strangles him with Christmas lights. Once he's dead, Flirty Stock Girl is terrified, and Billy kills her with a box cutter. He claims that punishment is necessary, something he apparently learned and internalized from Principal Nunn and various Killer Santas. The drunken store owner walks back to the stockroom and gets a hammer in his head for his troubles. At which point, the old lady who works at the store wanders back and Billy grabs an axe. A chase ensues and Billy somehow gets a hold of a bow and arrow, which is not a toy, in a toy store, and lets the arrow fly after the old lady trips him and steals his axe. Billy leaves the store and begins his rampage, or at least continues his rampage. For some reason, young Nunn visits the store on Christmas Eve, presumably to check on Billy. She instead finds the aftermath. Meanwhile, Billy, as Santa, has broken into the home of an older sister babysitting her younger sister while her parents are at a holiday party. She has sent her younger sister to bed and is taking the opportunity to have sex with her boyfriend. Billy breaks in and hangs the older sister on deer antlers mounted to the wall. The boyfriend fights Billy and gets a few good shots in with a fireplace poker. Ultimately, however, boyfriend is thrown through the window. The commotion has awoken the younger sister, where Billy, as Santa, asks if she's been naughty or nice. She says yes, she's been nice, and as a present, he gives her the box cutter he used to murder the girl earlier in the film. Then he leaves. The cops are on the lookout for Santa and come across him making his way up a ladder to a second-story window. They bust into the house and up to the room to find a father trying to surprise his daughter on Christmas playing Santa. Meanwhile, some bullies steal some other kid's sled. As they are sledding, Billy holds out his axe, and the bullies get a little off the top as heads roll. Billy is making his way back to the orphanage as younger Nunn is working with the police, as she thinks Billy is behind the killing. And rightfully so, because he is. As it turns out, the orphanage has booked a Santa, and a Santa has appeared at the door. It's Billy, and he goes to chop Principal Nunn, who is now wheelchair-bound. The police show up just in time to gun him down in front of the orphans, so in short, it's pretty standard Christmas. Billy is dead, and his little brother, older but still in the orphanage, looks to the camera and says, "Naughty." The end. And to all a good night. I think. Okay, so the film, when it came out, was controversial, but we will get to that a little later. Also, there is a sequel. Several, actually, but Silent Night, Deadly Night 2 is, well, interesting to say the least. That's the one I saw first. Confused the hell out of me, as they had no budget to make it, and it uses something like 40 minutes of the footage from this movie to pad the runtime. My rental store, for some reason, didn't have the first one, but they had all the sequels. Silent Night, Deadly Night 2, however, would eventually gain fame as the Garbage Day meme, but that's also a story for another time. The first few times I saw this movie, the first movie, I loved it, but I was engrossed in the strangeness of it, and I wasn't analyzing it in the way that I would if I were doing one of these episodes. I never realized that it is indeed a very unusual slasher film at the tail end of the first slasher era. This movie has no final girl or final boy. Our main character in the film is the villain. And yet, he's not entirely unsympathetic. He's not good, but we understand him in a way that we don't understand other slashers. For example, Freddy Krueger is never sympathetic or our main character. Granted, he and Jason and Michael Myers become the draw and appeal, but that was down the line after numerous sequels and an ever-growing deficit of ideas. Especially in the first films, we usually have very little backstory. Cropsey was a drunken caretaker at a summer camp who gets burned and comes back to exact revenge in The Burning. Other than he was a drunk and he hated kids and was mean, we know nothing. We know surprisingly little about Jason still, and very little about why Michael Myers went crazy that fateful Halloween night. However, we know exactly why Billy snaps in this movie. We know what he's gone through. Whenever I watch this movie, I feel really bad for him. He goes through this traumatic experience, and we are there every step of the way. We see the way that Billy is made. That doesn't excuse anything he does. But when he snaps, nobody in the audience is surprised, or at least they shouldn't be if they are. At the same time, during his childhood years in the orphanage, I personally feel terrible. I don't think he's actually all that terribly behaved, in the scenes that we see anyway. Especially considering what he's been through. Like I said before, I have no idea why the nuns don't think his past has affected him as much as it obviously has. Up front, we get all this character work and backstory, and then the rest of the movie is the killing spree. This is really rare and singular for a slasher, especially of this time. Usually you have the initial opening of the movie. In Friday the 13th, it's the kids being murdered. In Halloween, Michael Myers kills his sister. Then we're introduced to our final girl and other main characters. We get a little bit of backstory, and then at this point, one of the characters gets killed off, but it's not really noticed by anybody yet. Little by little, the killings increase. Then our final girl or boy realizes that he or she is in danger. We get some chase scenes maybe, a little more clarity and backstory, and then the final battle, and then bam, movie's over. In Silent Night, Deadly Night, we get all this information about Billy, and we see why and how he ends up going on a rampage. There is very little mayhem up front aside from his parents being murdered. This movie spends a good portion of its first and second acts establishing character. Other horror films would use subsequent sequels to flesh out further stories and characters, the mythos of the film series. With Silent Night, Deadly Night, however, we get it all in the first film, and it works well even though structurally speaking it's polar opposite of its contemporaries and even some of the films that came after it. There's a lot of sympathy to be had for Billy even though he goes nuts and is evil. When he does, it's no surprise. Simply, I'm surprised it took this long, if I'm surprised in anything. When it comes to Principal Nun, I have many issues. I don't believe that she was ever really interested in Billy's well-being. She sees him as a challenge to her authority and will, nothing more, or at least she seems to. She will break him and make him behave. To her, that is the only way. I don't think for a second she was any better with any of the other kids in the film, but they're not the main character, and I don't know how she was. The problem is that I never really perceived Billy as being a bad kid in this movie, just a traumatized kid. And even then, his instincts seem to be to clam up. He's not really acting out aside from drawing that weird picture earlier in the film. Principal Nun takes Billy's very existence as an insult. Let me, for example, take a small detour into a similar character. In American Horror Story Season 2, our setting is a mental asylum run by Catholics in the 60s. Jessica Lange plays the nun in charge. Evan Peters is a character that's in there for allegedly killing his wife or girlfriend. I don't remember which, and she was actually either killed or abducted by aliens. It's been a while since I've seen it, but you get the idea. Jessica Lange's head nun character is every bit as tough, rough and tumble as Principal Nun is in Silent Night, Deadly Night. However, Jessica Lange's nun believes in redemption. At a certain point, Evan Peters' character comes to her and says that there must be a reason for his time in the asylum, and that maybe it's time that he finds a path forward and he wants to be right with God. Jessica Lange's nun character is elated by this and shows Evan Peters' character some empathy and warmth. She's a little bit suspicious, but only because she doesn't want to believe that this is a lie or an act. She wants to believe it's genuine. She seems like she believes it's genuine. She's just a little scared that it's not. But overall, she's excited at the possibility that this lost soul has found his way to God. It's amazing. It's an amazing scene. Granted, she doesn't show a whole lot of empathy, but she is moved by the very possibility that this troubled soul is coming to her, and that the church to say, save me. In the case of Silent Night, Deadly Night, I don't think there was really anything Billy could have done that ever would have made Principal Nun happy or kind to him. It seems like no matter what, she would just hate Billy, or at least disbelieve him. Now, this movie is pretty harsh on nuns. I would argue that the younger nun is much kinder and shows nuns in a much more positive light. The truth is, there is a lot of darkness in the history of the church, and I don't want or need to go there. The ideology of Principal Nun in this movie is very accurate in my opinion. Granted, it reflects a bygone time. It's like that Death Cab for Cutie song where the nun tells him that fear is the heart of love. That line has always struck me as so right on and accurate and succinct. That line sums up the old school hardcore nun philosophy. I knew some of these nuns when I were a kid. They were all about 357 years old, and some of them meaner than a rabid porcupine. I was hit by one of them. On the other hand, I had two great aunts who were nuns, and they were always nice to me, even if they were a little bit weird and goofy. But nice. One of them I found out at her funeral was a guidance counselor, and a former student of hers stood up and said that my great aunt inspired her and profoundly guided her life into a meaningful and happy existence, which I never knew anything about. And, you know, what could be more meaningful than that, inspiring somebody else to greatness? I guess what I'm saying is you have to judge people and events on a case-by-case basis. On the one hand, you have Principal Nun, who is terrible, and Younger Nun, who is not at all terrible. There is a lot to like about this film. You have Scream Queen Linnea Quigley, a holiday-themed slasher that makes good use of its setting and concept, and some really nice location work. Silent Night, Deadly Night was filmed in Utah, and you can see the mountains in the background and the snow. The architecture and the external shots really gives it a distinct feel that sets it apart. It wasn't filmed in California, standing in for the Midwest like Halloween, or a generic kind of campground setting on the East Coast like Friday the 13th. It wasn't shot in Canada to make it look like New York or what have you. So, because of that, and the actual location work, Silent Night, Deadly Night feels different in a good way. The movie also feels Christmassy. It feels like it takes place at Christmas time, unlike pretty much any Hallmark holiday movie that they pump out, which is made in May and has a bunch of fake snow and Z-list actors sweating under the lights pretending to be cold. Before I round out this act, I just want to say that today's film dealt with severe mental health issues. If you have any mental health issues, I urge and encourage you to seek medical care and treatment. Seeking help for these things is the strongest thing you can do. As evident in today's movie, ignoring and suppressing mental health disorders is no way to treat them. And the holidays are a harder time indeed for people suffering from those issues. So, please, if you feel the need, get help. Act 2, The Crypt. A Christmas Story is a classic holiday film loved by many, but not me. For many years, one channel on television would show it 24 hours straight. While I have warmed to the movie slightly over the years, I still don't like it that much, as I just said. The film was directed by Bob Clark, who also directed raunchy 80s comedy Porky's. In 1983, Bob Clark made A Christmas Story. However, almost a decade earlier, he directed a stone-cold holiday horror classic, Black Christmas. Released in 1974, Black Christmas is an extremely early example of the slasher movie. It is also an exceptional example of a slasher movie and fully formed genre masterpiece 4 years before Halloween set the standard. Black Christmas has a lot of things going for it. Surprisingly, the strongest thing it has going for it is its final girl. Jess, played by Olivia Hussey, is one of the best and most well-rounded final girls in slasher cinema history, and she was basically the first. Olivia played Juliet in the 1968 Franco Zeffirelli production of Romeo and Juliet. They've shown this version in schools for many years whenever they're studying Shakespeare. It's been on TV all the time. I know I saw it a few times growing up, even though I really kind of hate Romeo and Juliet, so it is the standard of the Romeo and Juliet adaptation. She would also feature in horror films such as Ice Cream Man, Psycho 4, and the 1990 miniseries version of Stephen King's It. All great movies in one way or another. Black Christmas follows Jess. Without going into too much detail, the film takes place at Christmas time. Jess lives in a sorority house with some other girls, one of whom is Margot Kidder of Superman fame, as well as horror film Amityville Horror, Sisters, and Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. Unbeknownst to the girls at the sorority house, a killer mental patient has escaped and made his way to the house. He kills one of the girls and brings her up into the attic with him, where he begins to call the house, ranting and raving over the phone. Something about a missing baby and various characters and the maniac voices. His name may be Billy, but we really know very little about him. We don't even really see him. An eye here, and he runs by the camera once. He's wearing a black turtleneck and has curly brown hair. But other than that, we don't see him. We don't know who he is or what he looks like. This is in part because the film wants us to question whether Jess's boyfriend is the killer. Jess is dating Peter, played by Keir Dullea of 2001 fame, and has become pregnant. She does not plan on keeping the child, much to the chagrin of Peter. He plays piano and hockey because this movie was made in Canada in the 70s, and playing piano and hockey was a viable economic station to hold. Granted, it's been a while since I've seen this film, even though I love it so, but I do remember a scene with him playing hockey and in a room with a piano. Can't remember if he plays it, but I needed to make that joke. The obscene phone calls continue, and Jess and Peter continue to argue about their relationship and the baby. The police become involved and tap the phone to see where the calls are coming from. Another call comes from the obscene caller, which includes elements of arguments that Jess had with Peter. No one else was around for this. The first few traces are unsuccessful, and the police begin to suspect Peter. Eventually, the police discover that the calls are coming from inside the house. The killer then comes down from the attic and attempts to kill Jess, who flees into the basement and locks the door. Around the same time, Peter attempts to get into one of the basement windows. He tries to talk to Jess, and in her state of panic, beats Peter to death with a fire poker. The police find them sometimes later, Jess barely conscious and coherent. The police deduce that Peter was the killer and tried to kill Jess, so she defended herself by killing him. They close the case, put Jess to bed in her room. They post a police officer outside the house. The phone begins to ring inside the house, and we see the hatch to the attic begin to open. The killer has gone back into the attic and is coming out again. The end. We get to know Jess a lot over the course of this film. She's both vulnerable and strong over the course of the film, but not in a lopsided way. A lot of horror film heroines end up flip-flopping over the course of the film. They end up being dull, impulsive, and helpless one moment, and then strong and powerful the next. They flitter between the two, and are more of a product of what the filmmakers feel or screenwriters need for each individual scene, as opposed to creating a fully functioning character. Jess is responsible and smart, and yet has this pregnancy dilemma. We hear the arguments with her boyfriend about keeping it or not. Now, this is a controversial topic to this day, let alone back in 1974, in a slasher movie no less. In between slasher set pieces, we spend time with Jess and get to know her character in a much more in-depth way. In Halloween 78, we do indeed spend time with Jamie Lee Curtis's character Laurie Strode. We get that she's a good babysitter, who Tommy Doyle has a good relationship with. She's the more reserved one in her friend group, but after some initial characterization, we get into the horror suspense elements of the film, and the character work portion of the movie is over. I don't begrudge that, but the most important element of horror, or any film really, is that you have to care about the character in order for the horror and suspense to be the most effective. If you don't care about the main character, you don't care that they're almost going to be killed by Michael Myers. You don't care that in Lethal Weapon, Mel Gibson's character is suicidal. If you don't care, it doesn't really matter what these characters go through. Through their performance, through the writing, you have to make a character compelling. I don't care if the character is entirely likable. I don't care if the character is the best character ever and everybody loves her. Kind of like the Laurie Strode character in Halloween. But films really need to stop doing the it's the main character, therefore you care about them because I said so thing. One of my biggest pet peeves. I hate that. Especially in horror films. We as an audience care about Jess. We know who she is, and we see her struggles and her arguments with her boyfriend in a much deeper way than a lot of the other final girls. This is impressive in a lot of ways because this is one of the first modern slashers. The template has not been formed. The tropes have not really developed. This is 74. We're 4 years away from Halloween. Even more from Friday the 13th, etc. And a decade before Silent Night, Deadly Night. As much as I love Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which came out around the same time, we know very little about Sally Hardesty in that film, other than the fact that she has her brother Franklin, who's in a wheelchair, and that they're going on a trip with a bunch of friends. That's all we know about her. Luckily, that film is just so absurdly amazing that it works. It helps that Olivia Hussey has the cultural collateral of being the definitive film version of Juliet, or at least that was the prevailing theory for a lot of years. You may argue that some other actress to play Juliet was the definitive version, but for the longest time in cinema, the 68 version of Romeo and Juliet was considered, the gold standard. That, along with her performance in Black Christmas, does a lot towards us caring about her character. She added that depth. She has that added depth of boyfriend issues, and her character feels more like a person than a cliche. And that is exceptionally important. And it's a smaller detail that even films today overlook. Act 3. Silent Night, Deadly Night was released on November 4th, 1980 with the tagline, "You've made it through Halloween, now try and survive Christmas." I love this tagline. The poster featured a snowy rooftop with a chimney. An arm clad in a Santa suit holding an axe is sticking out the top of the chimney. I really like the poster art and think that it not only defines the movie really well, but it sets it apart from the other slashers of this period. It is distinctly this movie. Unfortunately, some of the other slasher movies of this period have generic posters that don't do the films justice. My Bloody Valentine's theatrical poster, as well as The Burnings, look too much like Friday the 13th clones and rip-offs. They look cheap, they're weird. And while those films were made to cash in on the success of Friday the 13th and Halloween, they are decent movies in their own right, and have a lot of things going for them. But back to Silent Night, Deadly Night. The film was released around the same time as A Nightmare on Elm Street, and actually, Silent Night, Deadly Night was outgrossing that film. However, the backlash began swiftly and earnestly. Parents were horrified at the film. The ads, and yes, even the poster, focused heavily on the killer Santa Claus aspect of the film. TV ads were run during times when children could see them, and of course this is the height of the first wave of the slasher boom. Parents and religious groups began to picket the film over its violence, as well as its negative depictions of Christmas and the holiday. If you look up the movie on YouTube, you can find old news stories about the controversy. Joining the protest was actor Mickey Rooney. If you don't know who he is, he was a big actor in the 40s and 50s and onward. If you're a millennial or a Gen Xer, you'll remember him from various commercials over the last few decades. The kind where he's hawking reverse mortgages, CPAP machines, silver coins, various insurances, etc. The last one I remember he did before he died was one where his wife is baking cookies and she slaps his hand as he tries to steal one with his wife laughing, and they're like, "Oh, they're for the grandkids." Then he starts to sell whatever he was meant to spell. The irony is that some years later, Mickey Rooney was the star of Silent Night, Deadly Night 5, The Toy Maker. So he kicks up a stink in 84, but come 90-91, he's starring in the movie. Now, to be fair, we don't know whether they did or did not tell him what they were making. They simply could have told him it was a horror movie called The Toy Maker, or a weird horror movie of Pinocchio, which, again, we'll get to, and said, "Hey, we'll give you $5,000 for 3 weeks' work on the film." I don't know if that happened. I'm just playing devil's advocate. Obviously, he was well into his career at that point and probably needed work. But the facts are, he protested the first movie and then came back years later to star in a sequel. After 2 weeks, the movie was pulled from theaters. But why was this movie so controversial in the first place? Well, I mean, you've got a Christmas slasher in the vein of the holiday-themed slasher craze. But it wasn't the first. Not by a long shot. British anthology movie Tales from the Crypt from 1972, inspired by the titular comic book series, featured 5 blood-curdling tales of terror. One of them, starring Joan Collins, was called And All Through the House, which featured a housewife terrorized by, you guessed it, a maniac in a Santa suit. The story, from the comics that inspired it, was published in 1954. Then, in 1980, came Christmas Evil, featuring a factory worker making toys who go crazy and decides that he needs to don the red suit and punish the naughty children. Sound familiar? Also in 1980, David Hess of Last House on the Left fame directed To All a Good Night, featuring, you guessed it, a killer and a Santa suit. There have been Killer Santas since Silent Night, Deadly Night 2. The one that sticks out in my mind the most for whatever reason is the wrestler Goldberg's Killer Santa movie, Santa's Slay. I don't entirely understand the controversy of the Silent Night, Deadly Night film. I get the backlash due to trying not to scare kids with the Santa stuff. I don't think it warranted pulling it from theaters. Perhaps if they just pulled the ads or aired them after a certain time, maybe that would have been okay. I mean, Silent Night, Deadly Night, content-wise, doesn't really differentiate itself much from its contemporaries in terms of violence and nudity. It was not really pushing the boundaries of those limits in my mind. Granted, it meets them, but it doesn't do anything to say we're going to be overly violent. The filmmakers delivered a solid holiday-themed slasher film. That's all we can really ask for. The other films that preceded it that featured Killer Santas for some reason didn't get the amount of attention that Silent Night did, therefore not generating a controversy. Maybe some of these films were drive-in movies, had limited releases, didn't have ad campaigns, who knows. But for some reason, Silent Night, Deadly Night got somebody's attention, became this big cultural controversy. Another theory that I tend to agree with was the release date. The theory goes that if it had been released a few weeks earlier, that it wouldn't have generated as much controversy as it did. If they had set it for a Halloween release or around then, it would have come and gone before the Christmas season really started. Whether that's true or not, who can say? The main actor who played Billy Chapman in the film, or at least the adult Billy Chapman, was allegedly kind of embarrassed for a long time about the movie until he found that fans really loved it. Some people saw it as a quirky, kind of unintentionally funny horror movie, and has since eased his perceptions of the movie. I think he does fine in the movie. I don't think there's any really super great performances, but we're talking about a standard run-of-the-mill slasher movie here. There was never going to be any kind of Laurence Olivier type performance in this. That's just not how these things work. That being said, I don't think anyone sticks out in the movie as being bad, unlike, let's say, the aunt character from Sleepaway Camp that leads a whole bunch of internet debate to this day, who I actually like, because think about it, she's in a scene for like 2 minutes, and that's the only scene she's in, and we're talking about her decades later. Silent Night, Deadly Night would go on to have 4 sequels. As stated before, the second installment is quite literally composed of reused scenes from the first. The third installment features a large part of the Twin Peaks cast and Bill Moseley from Texas Chainsaw 2. In that movie, Ricky, the younger brother of Billy, comes back as part robotic killer with a brain transplant, and there's a psychic girl. It's weird, but it's fairly watchable. Part 4 features witches at Christmas, and as I said before, Part 5 features Mickey Rooney, has some killer toys in it or something. It's also a Pinocchio retelling, albeit in a horror movie bent. I know I've seen it. I barely remember it. The entire movie seems like they had a couple of different scripts and they just mashed them all together and put Silent Night, Deadly Night 5 on it, which is very possible. The first film is best, and a great example of a basic and very competent holiday slasher that has some really interesting detours from the typical slasher formula. It's got a lot of great character work. It doesn't follow the same beats and tropes. It's a slasher movie that doesn't have a final girl or a final boy. It's a movie that really deserves a second look. That's our podcast for this week. Be sure to tune in next time for Horror Beneath the Surface. I have been your host, Professor Terror, otherwise known as Mark. Thanks for listening, and stay scared.